Edit the CEO demanded. Who closed the $50 million deal? The answer left him speechless. What could possibly make a simple question leave someone speechless? And why would the answer matter so much? Hello and welcome. We're so glad you're here to share another unforgettable story with us. If you enjoy powerful stories about integrity, quiet strength, and unexpected moments that change everything, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Thank you for your continued support. It truly means the world and helps us keep bringing these stories to life. Before we begin, tell us in the comments. If you were asked that question, what kind of answer would you expect? Now, settle in as this remarkable story begins. Who closed the $50 million deal? The question cracked through the executive boardroom with enough force to silence every whispered side conversation. Richard Hawthorne, the CEO of Hawthorne Dynamics, stood at the head of the polished walnut conference table, his sharp blue eyes sweeping across vice presidents, directors, and senior managers who had been celebrating only moments before. Crystal glasses sat untouched beside catered lunches, while a giant screen still displayed the headline announcing the company's biggest contract in nearly a decade. $50 million. It was the kind of victory that changed quarterly reports, investor confidence, and careers overnight. Yet instead of applause, an uneasy stillness settled over the room. No one answered. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. The vice president of sales cleared his throat but remained silent. The head of business development lowered her eyes toward a folder she suddenly found fascinating. Even the confident smiles that usually filled these meetings had quietly disappeared. Richard leaned forward, resting both hands on the table. I asked a simple question. His voice remained calm, but everyone recognized the dangerous edge beneath it. Who closed the $50 million deal? Again, nothing. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath a bright spring morning. Yellow taxis flowed through busy intersections, commuters hurried along crowded sidewalks, and life continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Inside the 42nd floor boardroom, however, time seemed frozen. Richard had spent 30 years building Hawthorne Dynamics into one of the country's fastest-growing logistics technology firms. He believed success always had a face, a name, and someone willing to stand behind it. Yet today, the largest agreement in company history appeared to belong to no one. Finally, someone from finance spoke carefully. Sir, according to the submitted reports, the negotiations involved several departments. Richard frowned. Several departments don't sign contracts. People do. His gaze drifted toward Claire Whitmore, the company's respected chief operating officer. At 34, Claire had earned a reputation for solving impossible problems with quiet precision rather than dramatic speeches. She glanced down at the digital report open on her tablet, scrolling through timelines, approval records, and internal summaries. Something about the paperwork bothered her. The numbers added up. The signatures were legitimate. The client had already wired the first payment. Yet one detail was strangely absent. There was no clear owner attached to the final proposal that had convinced the client to say yes. Claire slowly looked up. He's right, she said softly. There should be someone behind this. A faint murmur spread around the room. Richard folded his arms. Find that person. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. I don't care what department they're in, what title they hold, or whether they've been here 30 years or 30 days. Someone earned this company $50 million, and before this day is over, I intend to know exactly who they are. No one noticed that, 3 floors below the executive offices, a quiet man named Ethan Brooks was replacing a stack of printer paper before checking the time on his old wristwatch. In exactly 45 minutes, he needed to leave for his daughter's school concert, just as he always promised he would. Edit Ethan Brooks never expected anyone to remember his name, and over the years he had quietly accepted that reality. Every weekday began at 5:30 in the morning inside a modest brick duplex on the northwest side of Chicago. Before the sun climbed above the rooftops, he was already making blueberry pancakes because his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, insisted they tasted better on school days. Their kitchen was small, their furniture mismatched, and the coffee maker occasionally protested with strange noises, but laughter always found its place at the breakfast table. Ethan believed a peaceful home mattered more than expensive things. After walking Lily to the neighborhood bus stop, He drove his aging pickup truck through downtown traffic and arrived at Hawthorne Dynamics long before most executives entered the building. Officially, his position placed him inside the operations support department, where he handled workflow coordination, documentation reviews, and countless behind-the-scenes tasks that almost nobody noticed. Unofficially, people simply came to Ethan whenever something refused to work. A spreadsheet with broken formulas, a shipping report filled with inconsistencies, a presentation that needed clearer numbers, or a customer file that seemed impossible to organize somehow always landed on his desk. He never complained. He simply smiled, rolled up the sleeves of his blue button-down shirt, and quietly solved one problem after another. His co-workers appreciated his kindness, but very few understood the depth of his ability. Most assumed he was simply dependable. Some even joked that Ethan knew every corner of the company except the executive floor. He laughed with them because it was easier than explaining anything. Recognition had never been his goal. Responsibility had. Every paycheck meant another month of piano lessons for Lily, another payment toward her school supplies, another promise kept after the heartbreaking loss of her mother years earlier. During lunch breaks, while others debated promotions or bonuses, Ethan usually sat outside near a small landscaped courtyard with a homemade turkey sandwich and a paperback book. Sometimes younger employees joined him to ask for advice about confusing assignments or difficult clients. He never made them feel embarrassed for asking simple questions. Instead, he listened first, answered calmly, and encouraged them to trust their own judgment. Claire Whitmore had noticed that pattern months ago. More than once she had watched anxious employees leave Ethan's table looking lighter than when they arrived. She found it unusual that someone with no management title. By early afternoon, the celebration that had filled Hawthorne Dynamics only hours before had quietly transformed into something far more uncomfortable. Claire Whitmore returned to her office carrying a tablet filled with reports that should have answered every question, yet somehow explained almost nothing. She closed the glass door behind her and replayed the timeline once again. The client had spent nearly 4 months evaluating proposals from several national competitors. Every department had contributed pieces of the final presentation. Sales handled the relationship. Finance built the pricing model. Legal reviewed the contract language. Marketing polished the visuals. Operations coordinated implementation schedules. On paper, it looked like a flawless team effort. But Claire had worked in corporate strategy long enough to recognize a different pattern. Major breakthroughs almost never appeared by accident. Somewhere, someone had solved the one problem nobody else could solve. She leaned back in her chair, remembering the final client presentation held 2 weeks earlier. The atmosphere had been tense from the very beginning. The client's executive committee had questioned nearly every assumption inside the proposal. They challenged delivery timelines. They doubted projected efficiency gains. They questioned cost projections and implementation risks. By the end of that meeting, several Hawthorne executives privately admitted they believed the opportunity was already lost. Even Richard Hawthorne had instructed department heads to begin shifting resources toward other prospects. Then, something changed almost overnight. The client requested one revised proposal instead of walking away. Less than 48 hours later, they signed the agreement without asking for another negotiation. That sudden shift had puzzled Claire even then. She opened the final proposal again. The writing style felt different from earlier drafts. The recommendations were clearer. The financial projections connected naturally to operational realities. Even the language carried a calm confidence that replaced complicated corporate jargon with practical solutions. Whoever had prepared those revisions understood not only business strategy, but also the daily challenges facing the client. Claire quietly whispered to herself, "This is not the same document." Across the building, Richard instructed information technology to retrieve every saved version of the proposal along with internal editing records. He wanted timestamps, revision histories, approval logs, and email chains. Some executives shifted nervously at the request. Others insisted the investigation was unnecessary because the company had already won. Richard disagreed completely. "Success built on confusion becomes failure the next time," he told them. "If we do not understand why we succeeded, then we learned nothing." Meanwhile, Ethan Brooks remained focused on work that seemed completely unrelated to million-dollar contracts. A young analyst named Kevin stopped beside his desk, holding a stack of inventory reports with an apologetic expression. "I think I broke something," he admitted quietly. Ethan accepted the papers, reviewed them for less than a minute, and smiled gently. "You did not break anything. The formulas are reading last month's warehouse data instead of this month's. It happens more often than you think." Kevin released a relieved laugh. "I have been staring at that for an hour." Ethan adjusted 2 figures, corrected the spreadsheet, and handed it back. Sometimes stepping away for a minute helps more than staring harder. Kevin thanked him before hurrying toward another meeting, never realizing that the same patient mind solving ordinary office problems might also hold the answer everyone upstairs was desperately searching for. Outside Ethan's window, soft afternoon sunlight reflected across neighboring skyscrapers while the city moved at its usual relentless pace. Inside, Hawthorne Dynamics, invisible threads were slowly connecting. Digital records were beginning to tell a story that titles, business cards, and corner offices had completely overlooked. That evening, long before anyone began searching server records or digital histories, the office had looked almost deserted. Most of the executive floor had emptied after another exhausting day of unsuccessful negotiations. Cleaning crews quietly rolled supply carts through empty hallways. Elevators chimed only occasionally, and the city lights beyond the glass walls slowly replaced the fading sunset. Ethan Brooks remained at his desk because one unfinished task continued bothering him. It was not technically his assignment. No manager had requested his help. Yet every time he reviewed the proposal prepared for the client, something felt incomplete. The numbers were accurate. The graphics were polished. The legal language was flawless. But none of it answered the one question customers always cared about most. How would this solution actually improve everyday life for the people expected to use it? Ethan removed his reading glasses, rubbed his tired eyes, and opened a blank document beside the official proposal. He began writing notes, not as an executive trying to impress a boardroom, but as someone imagining himself standing inside the client's warehouses alongside ordinary employees loading trucks before sunrise. He simplified complicated paragraphs into plain language. He reorganized implementation schedules to reduce unnecessary delays. He noticed that one pricing assumption depended on unrealistic staffing levels, so he rebuilt the forecast using practical workforce data collected from previous projects. Every adjustment made the proposal easier to understand and more believable. Hours passed unnoticed. The office grew quieter until only the soft hum of air conditioning and the occasional click of computer keys remained. Ethan checked the time. 8:32 in the evening. Lily would already be asleep after calling to wish him good night. A small feeling of guilt crossed his heart, but he also knew that finishing this work tonight might help dozens of coworkers avoid weeks of frustration if the contract somehow survived. He never considered whether anyone would know who had made the changes. That thought simply never entered his mind. Around 9:15, Claire Whitmore unexpectedly returned to the office after realizing she had forgotten an important folder. As she stepped from the elevator, she noticed a single light glowing inside the operations area. Curious, she paused for only a moment. Through the glass wall, she recognized Ethan sitting alone, completely focused on his screen. He looked calm, almost peaceful, carefully reviewing page after page with remarkable patience. Claire considered walking over to ask why he was still there, but her phone rang before she reached the doorway. Another urgent call pulled her attention elsewhere, and by the time she finished speaking, Ethan had already left. The next morning, an updated proposal appeared inside the shared project system with only a simple note attached. Suggested revisions for team review. No signature. No request for recognition. No explanation. The document automatically became part of the collaborative project folder where dozens of employees had editing access. Later that afternoon, the sales team forwarded the revised version to the client, assuming someone from strategy had strengthened the presentation overnight. Strategy believed operations had merely corrected formatting. Operations assumed sales had finalized the language. Each department unknowingly thanked another. Meanwhile, Ethan quietly returned to ordinary responsibilities, helping coworkers solve routine problems, attending modest staff meetings, and leaving the office exactly at 5 o'clock so he could sit proudly in the front row of Lily's school concert, believing that keeping one promise to his daughter mattered far more than receiving credit for work no one would ever trace back to him. The contract was signed before anyone realized how many invisible hands had shaped its success, and by the following morning the headquarters buzzed with quiet excitement mixed with growing uncertainty. Department leaders congratulated one another in polished conference rooms, smiling for photographs and exchanging confident handshakes. Yet beneath every conversation lingered the same unanswered question: who had transformed a proposal that everyone believed would fail into one the client accepted without hesitation? Richard Hawthorne refused to let assumptions become facts. He instructed every department head to submit a complete timeline explaining their contribution to the project. Reports arrived by the hour, each professionally prepared and carefully organized. Sales described months of relationship building. Finance highlighted pricing strategies. Legal detailed contract revisions. Operations documented implementation planning. Every report contained valuable work, yet none explained the dramatic improvement that had changed the client's final decision. Claire Whitmore spread printed copies across the long conference table inside her office and compared them line by line. The more she studied them, the more one detail stood out. Nearly everyone described the revised proposal as if it had simply appeared. Some believed another department had written the final recommendations. Others admitted they had assumed the changes came from senior leadership. Nobody intentionally claimed credit for the decisive revisions because nobody honestly knew where they had originated. That mystery bothered Claire more than any missing signature. Great ideas usually left traces through conversations, meetings, or presentations. This one seemed to have arrived quietly, changed everything, and disappeared without leaving a face behind. While executives searched for answers, Ethan Brooks continued moving through another ordinary day. He helped a receptionist recover missing scheduling files, explained inventory data to a new supervisor, and patiently assisted an intern struggling to understand warehouse forecasting. Each conversation ended the same way. Ethan listened before speaking. He never rushed people. He never reminded them how busy he was. Those simple moments rarely appeared on performance reviews, yet they quietly shaped the culture around him. Shortly before lunch, Ethan noticed Kevin staring anxiously at a budgeting worksheet once again. Ethan smiled warmly. "Let us solve one problem at a time." Within minutes, the confusion disappeared. Kevin laughed with relief and thanked him sincerely. Ethan simply replied, "Someday someone else will need your patience too." Upstairs, Richard received another update from the Information Technology Department. The revision history had finally been recovered from the secure project server. Every saved version of the proposal was arranged in chronological order, including timestamps, editing activity, and user credentials. Richard looked toward Claire, who immediately noticed something unusual before opening the complete report. Nearly every revision involved formatting changes, scheduling updates, or legal corrections. Then, during one quiet evening after most employees had already gone home, the document underwent a dramatic transformation. Entire sections were rewritten. Financial assumptions became more practical. Operational strategies became clearer. Client concerns were answered before they could even be asked. The proposal that emerged afterward barely resembled the version that had existed only hours earlier. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair. "Now we are getting closer," he said calmly. Claire nodded without taking her eyes off the screen. The system had recorded every keystroke, every saved draft, and every digital footprint. Hidden inside those ordinary records was the name of the quiet employee who had never asked for recognition, and within moments the truth that had remained invisible to an entire company was about to reveal itself. Claire Whitmore held her breath as the information technology specialist expanded the final audit log across the large conference room display. Hundreds of routine edits filled the screen, each attached to familiar names from departments throughout the company. Most entries reflected ordinary collaboration. A pricing adjustment here, a grammar correction there, a revised implementation date. Then the timeline reached the evening that had changed everything. The room became unusually quiet. Between 7:43 and 9:19 that night, a single employee had rewritten the heart of the proposal. The audit trail showed page after page of thoughtful revisions, practical recommendations, and carefully calculated operational improvements. Every significant change that later impressed the client originated during that 96-minute window. Richard Hawthorne stepped closer to the screen. "Zoom in," he said calmly. The specialist enlarged the user information attached to every saved version. One name appeared again and again beside each decisive revision. Ethan Brooks. Silence settled over the room. Richard frowned, not because he recognized the name, but because he did not. "Who is Ethan Brooks?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Department heads exchanged uncertain looks. Finally, someone from Human Resources opened the employee directory. "Operations support," she replied. 9 years with the company. Richard looked surprised. 9 years. Claire quickly reviewed Ethan's personnel file. There were no executive titles, no management promotions, and no special awards highlighted across his employment history. Instead, every annual evaluation repeated nearly identical comments. Dependable, collaborative, exceptionally helpful, consistently exceeds expectations, trusted by coworkers. Claire slowly closed the file. "Interesting," she whispered. Everyone appreciated him, but nobody really saw him. Richard remained focused on the audit history. "Show me exactly what he changed." Side by side, the original proposal appeared beside Ethan's revised version. The differences were impossible to ignore. Complicated corporate language became clear and direct. Financial projections connected naturally to warehouse operations. Client concerns were answered before they appeared. Expensive recommendations that created unnecessary risk had quietly disappeared, replaced by realistic solutions supported by actual company data. It was not merely better writing. It demonstrated deep understanding of business, logistics, leadership, and people. Claire recognized something even more remarkable. Ethan had never criticized anyone else's work. Instead of replacing the team's effort, he had strengthened it. Every department's contribution remained intact, only clearer, wiser, and more useful. He made everyone look better, she said softly. Richard nodded without taking his eyes off the screen. That takes confidence. At that same moment, completely unaware of the discovery unfolding 3 floors above him, Ethan was helping the facilities manager carry several storage boxes into a supply room because one employee had called in sick. He thanked the manager for keeping the building running smoothly, then returned to his desk to finish organizing reports before leaving on time. His old wristwatch read 4:38. In less than 30 minutes, he planned to drive across town to attend Lily's piano recital. As always, that promise mattered more to him than staying late to impress anyone. Upstairs, Richard quietly folded his arms. "Bring Ethan Brooks to the executive conference room tomorrow morning," he said. "Not because I want to question him." He paused, looking once more at the extraordinary revisions that had secured the company's greatest victory. Because a man who works like this deserves to be thanked face to face. None of the executives spoke. For the first time that day, they realized the greatest talent inside Hawthorne Dynamics had never occupied the largest office. He had simply carried himself with quiet dignity while the rest of the company looked in the wrong direction. The following morning arrived with an unusual sense of anticipation that spread quietly through the executive floor. Secretaries spoke more softly than usual. Department heads postponed routine meetings, and even experienced managers wondered why the chief executive officer had requested their presence for an unscheduled gathering. Richard Hawthorne stood beside the conference room windows watching the city awaken beneath a pale blue sky. He had reviewed Ethan Brooks's revisions 3 more times before sunrise, and each reading strengthened the same conclusion. Skill could explain the technical improvements. Experience could explain the practical recommendations. But only genuine humility could explain why someone capable of that level of work had never asked for recognition. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Claire Whitmore entered with a calm expression. "He is here," she said. Richard nodded. "Please invite him in." A few seconds later, the conference room door opened again. Ethan Brooks stepped inside wearing the same neatly pressed blue shirt he wore on most workdays. He carried a simple notebook under one arm, believing he had probably been called upstairs to answer questions about operations or documentation. He looked around the room with quiet curiosity, noticing executives he had only seen from a distance during company meetings. "Good morning," he said politely. "You asked to see me?" Richard studied him for a moment before speaking. There was nothing dramatic about Ethan's appearance. No expensive watch, no designer suit, no air of self-importance. Only calm eyes, respectful posture, and the steady confidence of someone comfortable with honest work. Richard gestured toward a chair. "Please, have a seat." Ethan thanked him but remained standing until everyone else had settled first. The small gesture did not escape Claire's attention. Respect seemed natural to him, not performed. Richard finally broke the silence. "Mr. Brooks, yesterday I asked a question that nobody in this company could answer." Ethan listened without interrupting. "I wanted to know who transformed the proposal that secured our largest client agreement." Ethan's expression remained unchanged. "Our audit records identified every revision," Richard continued. "They also identified the person responsible." Ethan glanced briefly toward the large display showing the proposal history. He recognized the timeline immediately. For the first time, he realized why he had been invited upstairs. Instead of looking proud, he appeared slightly uncomfortable. "I hope I did not overstep," he said quietly. "The proposal belonged to the entire team. I only thought a few practical adjustments might help." Several executives exchanged surprised looks. They had expected explanations, perhaps even quiet satisfaction. Instead, they heard an apology from the man who had solved the company's greatest challenge. Claire leaned forward. "Do you understand that your revisions changed the entire direction of the negotiation?" Ethan offered a modest smile. "The sales team built the relationship. Finance created a solid pricing structure. Legal protected the agreement. Operations prepared implementation. I simply connected the pieces so the client could see the complete picture." Once again, silence filled the room. Richard slowly folded his hands together. During decades in business, he had met brilliant consultants, gifted negotiators, and ambitious executives, but very few people willingly placed everyone else ahead of themselves after accomplishing something extraordinary. In that quiet moment, every title around the conference table seemed less important than the character of the man standing before them. The greatest surprise was no longer who had rewritten the proposal. It was discovering that genuine greatness had been working among them for 9 years without ever demanding to be seen. Richard Hawthorne remained silent for several seconds, allowing Ethan's words to settle over the room. In an age where people often competed for recognition, the man standing before him seemed almost determined to give it away. Finally, Richard spoke with genuine curiosity rather than authority. "Mr. Brooks, why did you never tell anyone what you had done?" Ethan smiled gently, as though the answer had always been simple. "Because the goal was never for people to notice me," he replied. "The goal was for the client to trust the company." No one interrupted him. Even the executives who usually filled every silence with opinions waited patiently for him to continue. Ethan rested both hands on the back of the chair in front of him. "When I joined Hawthorne Dynamics 9 years ago, someone told me that every job inside this building mattered, even if nobody outside ever knew your name. I believed that then, and I still believe it today. If the proposal succeeded, everyone benefited. If it failed, pointing to my own contribution would not have helped anyone." Claire Whitmore watched him with growing admiration. She had spent years leading talented people, but she had rarely encountered someone whose confidence was so completely separated from personal recognition. "You could have advanced your career much sooner," she said softly. Ethan nodded, without disagreement. "Perhaps. But every afternoon at 5 o'clock there is someone waiting for me who does not care about my title." A warm smile crossed his face as he reached into his notebook and carefully removed a small photograph. It showed Lily standing beside an upright piano after her latest recital, smiling with quiet pride. "My daughter measures success differently," he said. "She only asks whether I kept my promises. If I tell her I will be in the front row, then that is where I belong." The room grew even quieter. Richard glanced at the photograph before looking back at Ethan. Suddenly, many small details from his personnel record made sense. The consistent departure time, the lack of overtime requests, the absence of self-promotion. None of it reflected a lack of ambition. It reflected carefully chosen priorities. Claire remembered seeing Ethan leave exactly at 5 o'clock countless times, while others remained in the office chasing promotions. She had assumed he simply valued work-life balance. Now she understood something much deeper. He had been protecting the one responsibility that mattered most to him. Richard slowly walked toward the conference room window, looking out over the city before turning back. "Do you know what impressed me most about your revisions?" he asked. Ethan shook his head. "You never tried to prove someone else was wrong. You simply made their work stronger. That is leadership." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. "People usually do their best with the information they have. Sometimes they only need another perspective, not another critic." Claire exchanged a quiet glance with Richard. Those words carried more wisdom than many expensive leadership seminars. Around the table, several executives reflected on their own habits, realizing how often they had focused on individual credit instead of shared success. In that peaceful conference room, surrounded by polished wood, glass walls, and impressive titles, the greatest lesson of the week came not from the chief executive officer or the chief operating officer, but from a humble single father who believed that dignity required no applause, excellence needed no spotlight. And the strongest legacy a person could build was the trust they earned from others, one quiet promise at a time. Richard Hawthorne slowly extended his hand across the conference table, and Ethan Brooks accepted it with the same quiet humility he had shown throughout the meeting. "Thank you," Richard said sincerely, "not only for securing this agreement, but for reminding all of us what real leadership looks like." There was no dramatic celebration, no loud applause, and no speeches prepared for investors. Instead, there was something far more meaningful. Every executive in the room rose to their feet, not because anyone instructed them to, but because respect had quietly replaced surprise. Claire Whitmore smiled warmly. "Mr. Brooks, I would like to offer you the opportunity to lead a new strategic operations initiative. The position comes with greater responsibility, a larger office, and the recognition you have more than earned." Ethan listened carefully before answering. "I am deeply honored," he replied. "I would be happy to accept the responsibility, but there is one condition." Richard raised an eyebrow with genuine curiosity. "Name it." Ethan smiled in the calm, unhurried way that had become so familiar. "Every day at 5 o'clock, I leave to pick up my daughter. That promise cannot change." For a brief moment, complete silence filled the room once again. Then Richard smiled. "If anyone here believes that keeping a promise to your child is a weakness, they have misunderstood leadership entirely." He extended his hand once more. "The position is yours, and your schedule remains exactly as it is." Relief softened Ethan's face. "Thank you." "No," Richard answered gently. "Thank you." News of the meeting quietly spread throughout Hawthorne Dynamics over the following weeks. Employees were surprised to learn that the thoughtful man who had patiently answered questions in the cafeteria, repaired confusing spreadsheets without complaint, and treated everyone with equal respect had been the mind behind the company's greatest success. Yet Ethan himself changed very little. He still greeted the reception staff every morning. He still helped new employees understand complicated reports. He still thanked the maintenance crew whenever he passed them in the hallway. The only visible difference was that more people now listened when he spoke, not because his character had changed, but because they had finally taken the time to notice it. Claire often reflected on that remarkable week. She realized the company had spent years searching outside for extraordinary talent while overlooking extraordinary character already walking its own hallways. Richard later introduced a new leadership principle during executive meetings. "Reward results," he would say, "but never ignore quiet integrity. The loudest voice is rarely the strongest foundation." That lesson gradually reshaped the culture of the company. Collaboration became more important than competition. Mentorship became more valuable than personal credit. Respect was measured less by titles and more by the way people treated one another. That Friday evening, Ethan parked his old pickup truck outside Lily's school just as the final bell rang. She spotted him immediately, waved excitedly, and ran toward him with a bright smile. "You came," she said happily. Ethan knelt to give her a warm hug. "I told you I would." As they walked hand in hand toward the truck beneath the golden light of the setting sun, no expensive office, executive title, or corporate achievement could equal the quiet joy of that simple promise kept. Sometimes the greatest victories are not the ones celebrated in boardrooms. Sometimes they are found in the peaceful silence that follows a life lived with dignity, grace, and unwavering faithfulness, proving that true success belongs to those who lift others without asking to stand above them.